Okay, welcome to this A-level anthology video looking at Anthology 3 Rahula. This is section 1 of the 27 paragraphs we find in this artifact, this chapter from Gems and Buddhist Wisdom by Rahula. So let's read it and then we can annotate it. There is a widespread belief, particularly in the West, that the ideal of the Theravada, which they conveniently identify with Hinayana, is to become an Arhat, while that of the Mahayana is to become a Bodhisattva, and finally to attain the state of a Buddha. It must be categorically stated that this is incorrect. The idea was spread by some early Orientalists at a time when Buddhist studies were beginning in the West, and others who were following them accepted it without taking the trouble to go into the problem by examining the texts and living traditions in Buddhist countries. But the fact is that both the Theravada and Mahayana unanimously accept the Bodhisattva ideal as the highest. So what's going on here? What is the myth that Rahula, and who is Rahula? Well, we thought about that already. What is the myth that he's creating here about Western naivety? And why is he trying to suggest this? He says, particularly in the West. Okay. Well, we need to understand that by the West, Rahula is really referring to Western academics today, with whom he disagrees. Think A.L. Basham, of course, and probably Harvey and Williams et al., objective external scholars. For Rahula, myth, rhetoric is his rhetoric is a sort of polemic attacking the credibility of religious studies scholars who don't share his convictions, his doctrinary commitments to Theravada. Who then are Theravada? We really should know this. Theravada, well, Damien Keown talks of Theravada as the way of the elders, the Theras, and as only one of the early Buddhist schools, of which the Hinayana or small vehicle has survived down to modern times. Today, Theravada is the dominant tradition of Buddhism throughout Southeast Asia, particularly Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. According to tradition, the school spread initially as a result of missionary activity after being brought to Sri Lanka by Mahinda, the son of Asoka, although that's not to be believed. So we have this word Hinayana. What is? Let's underline it here. Hinayana. What does that mean? Well, what Rahula is doing here is kind of a collapse, collapsing together the history of critical scholarship, which originally accepted the term Hinayana and which has its origin in present and past Mahayana apologists as a sort of pejorative term aimed at Theravada. By the way, Theravada is a term that's fairly recent. In 1950, the World Fellowship of Buddhists declared that the term Hinayana should not be used when referring to any form of Buddhism existing today. Slap on the wrist for Mahayana's polemics. In the past, the term was widely used by Western scholars to cover the earliest system of Buddhist doctrine. Modern Buddhist scholarship has depreciated the pejorative term and uses instead the term Nikaya Buddhism to refer to these early Buddhist schools. So identify is to become an Arhat. What is this word Arhat? Again, from Keown's Dictionary of Buddhism, The word means a worthy one who's attained the goal of enlightenment or awakening. Essentially, an arhat consists in someone who has, by following the way of the elders, eradicated the outflows, that are the defilements. The arhat is free of, it's thought, 10 fetters. And as you look through the various writings, there are these 10 fetters that prevent you from being enlightened. So the difference between an arhat and a Buddha is that the Buddha attained enlightenment by himself, whereas an arhat does it by following the teachings of the Theras and the traditions that are thought to go back to the Buddha. But it should be noted that the Buddha is also an arhat and is frequently addressed as such in invocations such as the Pali formula Namo Tassa Bhavata Arahato Sama Sambuddhassa. Homage to the Lord, the worthy one, the perfectly awakened one. You will hear this repeated often at the beginning of liturgies in Theravada, probably with better pronunciation. As taught in early Buddhism, the Arhat attained exactly the same goal as the Buddha, perhaps. In Mahayana Buddhism, however, they believe the term arhatship as an inferior ideal to that of Buddhahood, and portray the arhat somewhat unfairly as selfishly concerned with the goal of private nirvana. Typically, some of the Lotus Sutra metaphors and similes and parables suggest it's an illusory halfway goal, like a magic city. In contrast, they placed emphasis on great compassion, Mahakaruna, as their understanding of enlightenment, of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas who dedicate themselves to leading all beings to salvation. So what then is Mahayana? Here it is here. Again, Keon, we should know this. It's a Sanskrit term, great vehicle, a major movement in the history of Buddhism, embracing many schools in a sweeping reinterpretation or a series of reinterpretations of fundamental religious ideals and beliefs and values. There is no evidence for the existence of Mahayana prior to the 2nd century CE properly. Maybe we could talk about Proto-Mahayana, but it can be assumed that the movement began to crystallize earlier, incorporating the teachings of existing schools. That's what Keown says. So we see the origins now. Now, in Mahayana, a great emphasis is placed on the twin values of compassion, karuna, and insight, prajna. The bodhisattva who devotes himself to the service of others becomes the new paradigm for religious practice, and this is opposed to the arhat, who is criticized for leading a cloistered life devoted to self-interested pursuit of liberation. Schools which embrace the earlier ideal are henceforth referred to despairingly as the Hinayana, small vehicle, or the Stravakyana, the vehicle of the hearers. These are derogatory terms. They come up especially in the Lotus Sutra parable of the burning house. So what then is the opposite? The Bodhisattva. The Mahayana is a Bodhisattva. Well, that's interesting. And it's, again, Keown says, the Pali, Bodhisattva, notice that Bodhisattva is Sanskrit, is the embodiment of the spiritual ideal of Mahayana Buddhism, in contrast to earlier. Is it earlier? Well, our ideal invocated by the Hinayana. Bodhisattva literally means the enlightenment being, but the correct Sanskrit derivation may be Bodhisakta, meaning a being who's orientated towards enlightenment. It's a much broader term than the previous one. The ideal is inspired by a lengthy career of a Buddha before he became enlightened. It's described in the Jatakas. Remember, the Buddha was born over and over and over again, and this is elevated within Mahayana as a good thing. You return to life after life to help others, and the Jatakas are found within Mahayana. And within Mahayana, they're understood as the Buddha as a bodhisattva who vows to return life after life to help others. So the Bodhisattva's career, like the Buddha's career, by generating the aspiration. So the first of the stages to achieve enlightenment, not for yourself, but for the sake of all beings. And this is in terms of a vow, which according to many Mahayana texts is often accompanied by the prediction of success by a Buddha. He then embarks on the path leading to enlightenment by cultivating the 6 perfections, later 10 perfections, and the 4 means of attracting beings over the course of immeasurable kalpas, or periods of time. So the kind of spiritual progress of the Bodhisattva, developing the perfections and so on, is usually subdivided into 10 stages or levels, like a computer game. Many Mahayana sutras state the Bodhisattva forgoes his own final enlightenment until all beings in samsara have been liberated. Virtually never. So far into the mystical future as probably never. Or else described in a special form of nirvana as a unlocalized nirvana. These are more difficult ideas, by virtue of which the Bodhisattva may enter in the world but not of it. We have the merging of the Sambhakaya realm, the heavenly realm. Earlier Mahayana sutras are specific in their belief that the Bodhisattva can only be male, but later texts would allow the possibility of female Bodhisattvas. So what state is Rahula referring to here? Why should we contest his language already? And is his economy with the truth reflective of his polemic agenda? So he just says, the state. The state? What state? But here, Rahula is not exploring the full range and meaning of the goals of Mahayana. He doesn't consider the use of Buddha nature or trachea, and will only later consider becoming a compassionate being because he's protesting. Theravada also do this without exploring the idea of upaya, skillful and expedient means, central to the Mahayana conception of it. Mahayana generally don't think they want to get to Nibbana, to become awakened. Is Rahula right that the assumption is false and that they're really 2 different goals? So he goes on, categorically stated that this is incorrect. 2 different goals? So there's a question here of how you get salvation, how you get rescued, how you get right on the religious journey, of soteriology, the theory of salvation, and of the case he will build for the superiority and truth of the Theravada soteriological claim over the Mahayana claims. He is a being critical of Basham and other Western secular scholars like Gombrich. And Gombrich's view, there are 2 different, equally valid false claims of Theravada and Mahayana. However, his loud, his vertissimo rhetoric may hide a key weakness. So he talks of the Orientalists. Let's underline Orientalists. Who are the Orientalism? Well, beginning sort of with the colonialists, Western scholarship was interested in these worlds, these exotic worlds they were dominating. And in the 18th and 19th century, Orientalism was an observation of the local languages and local practices across not only Buddhist and Hindu countries, but this would also include Islamic countries. It was interested in the languages, the literatures, the religions, the philosophies, histories, the art, the laws of the Asian societies, especially ancient ones. Such scholarship also inspired the broader intellectual and artistic circles in Europe and North America. So Orientalism may also denote the general enthusiasm for all things Asian or Orientalism. So Orientalism includes not just those focused on Buddhism, but like Lord Byron, other religions. In the 1820s, the influence of the Anglicanists. This was a special Oriental school led by this guy, Thomas Babington Macaulay, and John Stuart Mill led to promote, who you know from utilitarianism, led to the promotion of the Anglo-centric education. Western education is the best, isn't it? So when did Buddhist studies begin in the West? When Buddhist studies were beginning in the West. What's the difference in Orientalism and Buddhist studies? Well, Buddhist studies is different to Orientalism. It's less of a colonialist term, isn't it? Early Buddhist studies, Orientalism in other words, had focused on historical philological approach, that focused on books, texts, to get back to what is proper Buddhism, original Buddhism. That's a mistake, perhaps. In his book Orientalism, this cultural critic, Edwards, said he redefines the term Orientalism to describe a pervasive Western tradition, academic and artistic, of prejudiced outsider interpretations of the Eastern world, which was shaped by the cultural attitudes of European imperialism in the 18th and 19th century. So, not such a good thing. So, Buddhist studies tries to distance itself from Orientalism. So Buddhism and Buddhist studies gained a foothold amongst significant Western academics in the 1960s and 70s as it gained a foothold amongst young people seeking religious experience and expression. Think the Beatles going to India. The interest of Westerners in Buddhism was fostered by the work of Buddhist missionaries, such as the Japanese scholar Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, and Tibetan Buddhist teachers who moved to the West, mostly following the Chinese conquest of their homeland in 1959. So did the early Buddhologists, Buddhist study practitioners, really not study the texts, but without taking the trouble to go into the problem by examining the texts and living traditions? Now that's really interesting, because it seems to me the opposite is the case. The early Buddhist studies were interested in only the texts. They were text heavy. And Rahula here is stretching a point to make a point, because the Pali Canon did not begin to be translated into English really into the 1900s with the founding of the Pali Text Society. So he's got a technical point. However, the texts were very much the focus and interest of Orientalists, and it seems rather that Rahula just does not like their interpretation and wants to use rhetoric to persuade us of his Theravada view of salvation, soteriology. Rahula is in fact ignoring Eastern Buddhist studies. The Eastern Buddhist Society was founded in 1921 by D.T. Suzuki and brought a more Zen perspective, a Mahayana perspective. He ignores early Buddhist studies in Japan because that doesn't fit his narrative. In the mid-19th century, Buddhism was introduced to the United States and other Western countries by large numbers of immigrants from China, Japan, and other countries. So when somebody says the fact is, but the fact is it? That's you need to ask. Is it? Rahula is making an argument that uses terminology in a slippery way. Yes, both have the idea of a bodhisattva, but in Theravada, it's of minimal importance. It's not a goal. The bodhisattva isn't really a goal. The term only applies to the Buddha and perhaps some of the kings of Sri Lanka. Quite an elitist title for very few people. In Mahayana, it's a much more expansive term, refers to the means of salvation that anyone can access. You just have to vow and then start practicing the 6 virtues and then wait to be reborn life after life. So Rahula says Mahayana unanimously accepts the bodhisattva ideal as the highest. But do they? Thesis Theravada and Mahayana unanimously accept the bodhisattva as the highest. Really? Rahula here is, in fact, obscuring what other tradition believes in order to show they are wrong. Again, this is vertissimo or loud emotive language. They unanimously, it's very seductive. It encourages no dissent. There's a lot of that around. Listen to people who try and twist you with their words. Or it discourages any more complex understanding. It's really simple, honest. They all agree. We all agree on the same thing. I hear it a lot in Christianity. People who want to say everybody should. We all really believe the same thing, and then you ask them what we all really believe, and it's something really that you don't believe. The reality is he's wrong about both Mahayana and Theravada. Not all Mahayana merely see the goal as becoming compassionate. Some talk about Buddha nature. Most today see discovering their Buddha nature as the goal. Most Theravada see the Arahat path as the goal, not becoming a king or a Buddha. And in fact, really, if you talk about most Theravada, it's only the monks who do that. So we have to be careful with what he says.